Ceres, the daughter of the powerful alien king, stood on the battlefield, her heart racing. The air was thick with smoke, and the sounds of battle echoed in every direction. She was not like the other soldiers. Her father had warned her to stay behind, to remain safe within the palace walls. But Ceres had always been different. She wanted to prove herself, to show that she was just as strong as any of the men fighting around her. The war was brutal. It had torn through entire planets, and Ceres' people were losing. Her father, King Varric, had made many enemies, but none of them were as dangerous as his own daughter. Ceres was rebellious, and her fiery spirit often clashed with the king's strict rules. Despite being the heir to the throne, she had always felt like a prisoner in her father's court. Today, she had defied him one more time. While the king sat in his palace, giving orders to his generals, Ceres had slipped away, disguised as a regular soldier. She had fought fiercely alongside the troops, determined to make a name for herself in this war. But her actions had consequences. As the battle raged on, Ceres found herself at the front lines, surrounded by enemies. Her troops had been pushed back, and there was no way to retreat. Desperation filled her chest as the enemy's forces closed in, their weapons gleaming in the dim light of the dying sun. She fought with all her might, but it was clear that she was outnumbered. In the midst of the chaos, Ceres heard a voice crackling through her communicator. It was her father's voice, cold and distant. "Ceres, return to the palace at once. This war is not your fight." King Varric's words cut through the noise of the battlefield. But it was too late. Ceres knew she could not return. She had gone too far. Her pride, her need to prove herself, had led her to this moment. "Do not worry about me, father. I can handle this," she said through gritted teeth, her voice trembling with determination. But her father was not convinced. The message that followed was brief but chilling. "Abandon her. She is lost." With those words, Ceres was abandoned. Her father's people turned their backs on her, leaving her to fend for herself. The soldiers around her hesitated for a moment, but then they too turned away, following the king's orders. Ceres was left alone in the desert. The enemy closed in, and the battle quickly became a nightmare. Ceres fought bravely, but it was no use. The weight of her decisions, her rebellion, pressed down on her like the desert sun. She fought until her strength faded, and finally, she collapsed, her body too tired to move. The desert was unforgiving. The heat was unbearable, and the wind howled like a wild animal. The sand burned her skin as she tried to crawl toward any sign of shelter. There was none. The battle had left everything in ruins, and now the desert would be her grave. For hours, Ceres lay there, too weak to move. She could hear the distant sounds of the enemy, but they were far away. She was alone, completely alone. The reality of what had happened began to sink in. Her father, the king, had given up on her. His soldiers had left her behind like an unwanted tool, cast aside in the heat of war. In her moment of greatest need, there was no one to help her. She had spent her life defying authority, but now she understood the true meaning of abandonment. As the hours turned into days, Ceres struggled to survive. The sun scorched her skin, and the thirst felt like fire in her throat. She had no food, no water, and no hope. The pride that had once driven her to rebel now seemed like a foolish mistake. She could hear her father's voice in her mind, telling her that she was nothing but a disappointment. He had warned her to stay safe, but she had ignored his advice. Now she was paying the price. Ceres' once strong resolve was weakening. She felt herself slipping into unconsciousness, her body giving up. She had never imagined that this would be how she would die, alone in the desert, abandoned by her own people. But just as she thought it was over, something inside her stirred. It was a flicker of defiance, the same spirit that had led her to defy her father. She couldn't let this be the end. She wouldn't let it be. With everything she had left, Ceres struggled to rise to her feet. The desert seemed endless, but she forced herself to move, one step at a time. She would survive. She had to survive. Her thoughts were scattered, but a single clear idea filled her mind. They will regret this. They will regret leaving me to die. Ceres stumbled through the endless desert, her body aching with every step. The sand beneath her feet was hot and unyielding, burning her skin with every movement. The sun blazed overhead, relentless in its fury. The sky seemed to stretch on forever, a pale blue void that offered no answers, no help. She was alone. Her body was weak, her mind clouded with hunger and thirst. Her throat was dry, and every breath felt like a struggle. She hadn't had anything to drink for hours, maybe days. The desert, once vast and beautiful, now felt like a cage. She was trapped, and there was no escape. Ceres had always been strong. She had trained her entire life to be a warrior, to fight and survive no matter the odds. But nothing had prepared her for this. The heat was overwhelming, and the desert's silence was deafening. Her pride, once her greatest strength, now seemed like a foolish thing. She had been so sure of herself, so sure that she could handle anything. Now, the only thing she could handle was the emptiness of the desert. She stumbled again, her legs giving way beneath her. She fell to her knees, the pain shooting through her body. Her vision blurred, and for a moment she thought she might faint. But she refused to give in. She had come too far. She couldn't die here, alone in the sand. She would not let the desert be her grave. Ceres forced herself to her feet, ignoring the waves of dizziness. The heat seemed to press down on her, making it harder to breathe. She looked around, hoping for some sign of life, some trace of hope. But all she saw was the endless expanse of sand, stretching in every direction. Hours passed, and the sun began to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows over the desert. The air grew colder, but the relief it brought was only temporary. Ceres knew she couldn't survive much longer without water. Her body was running on empty, and every step felt like a battle. She needed shelter. She needed to find something, anything, that could help her survive the night. But the desert seemed to mock her. There was nothing here but sand and heat, stretching on forever. She felt as if she were losing herself in it. Then, as the shadows grew longer, Ceres saw something in the distance. At first, it was just a flicker, a small shape on the horizon. Her heart skipped a beat. Was it a mirage? Was her mind playing tricks on her? She blinked, her vision swimming. But when she looked again, it was still there. A dark shape against the desert's orange glow. With renewed hope, Ceres pushed herself forward. Her steps were slow, weak, but she kept moving. Every inch of her body screamed for rest, but she couldn't stop now. The shape grew larger as she approached, and soon she saw that it was a large rock formation, a small cave hidden within the desert's harsh landscape. She rushed toward it, almost stumbling in her haste. The coolness of the cave's shadow felt like a blessing. She crawled inside, finding a small alcove where she could sit and rest. The cave was dark, but it offered protection from the sun, and that was all she needed right now. Ceres leaned back against the rocky wall, her breathing shallow. She was exhausted, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to close her eyes and rest. The world outside was still, the wind whispering through the desert in soft, haunting gusts. But rest was a fleeting luxury. As the night settled in, hunger and thirst gnawed at her from the inside. She had no food, no water, and the small cave offered no help in that regard. But Ceres was not one to give up easily. She had to keep going. She had to find a way to survive. The night passed slowly, the desert's cold air biting at her skin. But as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, Ceres stirred. Her body was weak, but she knew that she couldn't stay in the cave forever. She had to find water. She had to find food. Ceres forced herself to her feet, her head spinning. Her mind was foggy from exhaustion, but there was one thought that kept her going. Survive. Just survive. She stumbled back out into the desert, the sand shifting beneath her feet. The sun was rising again, and the heat began to return. But this time, Ceres wasn't afraid. She had faced this before. She had fought for her life before, and she would do it again. Hours passed as Ceres wandered the desert, her legs growing weaker with every step. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. The desert seemed endless, and the thirst was becoming unbearable. She could feel her body shutting down, but still, she pushed on. It was when she thought she couldn't go any further that she saw something ahead. A small patch of greenery, a few desert plants clustered together. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She stumbled toward it, her hands shaking as she pulled the plants from the ground. She didn't care what they were. She just needed something. As she chewed on the dry leaves, her mind began to clear. The water would come later. For now, she had found something. And that small victory was enough to keep her going. Ceres knew she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. She would survive this desert, just like she had survived everything else. And one day, when she returned to her people, they would regret leaving her behind. Days passed, and Ceres continued her journey through the unforgiving desert. The sun beat down relentlessly, and her body had grown thinner with each passing hour. Her mind was clouded with exhaustion, but there was a fire inside her that refused to go out. She couldn't let this be the end. She had already lost everything: her people, her family, her pride. But she would not let the desert claim her life. Her eyes, once bright with defiance, had started to fade, and the will to survive was beginning to feel like the only thing she had left. The days seemed to blur together in a haze of heat and thirst. Yet despite her body growing weaker, Ceres felt something new inside her. A deep, quiet strength that was different from the fiery defiance she had once carried. This strength felt ancient, like it had always been a part of her, buried beneath layers of pride and rebellion. One day, as she wandered the barren landscape, Ceres stumbled upon something she hadn't expected. An odd, jagged structure half buried in the sand. It looked like an ancient ruin, long forgotten by time. Her heart skipped a beat as she approached. Her curiosity piqued. Was this a remnant of some long-lost civilization, or was it just another trick of the desert? With her strength running low, she dragged herself to the structure. As she stepped closer, she noticed strange markings on the stone walls, symbols that glowed faintly under the harsh sun. Ceres reached out to touch the symbols, and as her fingers brushed against them, she felt a sudden jolt of energy course through her body. She gasped in surprise, her heart racing. It wasn't the familiar pain of exhaustion. No, this felt different. It was as if something was awakening inside her, something ancient and powerful. The ground beneath her feet shifted, and the stones around her began to shift, revealing a hidden entrance. Ceres hesitated for a moment, but then, driven by desperation and the strange power that seemed to call to her, she stepped inside. The air inside the structure was cool, a welcome relief from the harsh desert outside. It smelled old, like the scent of dust and forgotten memories. The walls were lined with intricate carvings, and the faint glow from the symbols illuminated the space in a soft, ethereal light. As Ceres moved deeper into the ruin, she felt an overwhelming sense of awe. She had discovered something ancient, something that had been lost for centuries, perhaps even longer. In the center of the room, there was a large stone pedestal with a glowing crystal resting upon it. Ceres approached it slowly, her hands trembling with both fear and excitement. As she reached out to touch the crystal, the room suddenly hummed with energy. A surge of power rushed through her, and her vision blurred. For a moment, she thought she might collapse, but instead, something changed within her. It was as if the very essence of the crystal had merged with her, giving her a surge of energy and strength she had never felt before. The moment the power settled inside her, Ceres collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. Her body felt lighter, but stronger, as if the weight of the desert had been lifted. The crystal had given her more than just energy. It had unlocked something hidden deep inside her, something that had been dormant for far too long. Her thoughts raced. What was this power? What had just happened? She didn't understand it, but she knew one thing for sure. She was no longer the same person who had been abandoned in the desert. She was different, stronger, smarter. For the first time since her abandonment, Ceres felt a sense of hope. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was changing. She was becoming something greater than the rebellious princess who had defied her father's orders. She was evolving into something new, something powerful. This crystal had awakened her potential, and she could feel it deep within her bones. She had the strength to fight back, to prove herself, not just to her father, but to the galaxy itself. Ceres stood up, her body still trembling but now filled with purpose. She could feel the power coursing through her, and she knew that she had been given a second chance. She would not waste it. The desert had taken everything from her, but now it had given her something far greater. She had discovered a force within herself that no one, no enemy, no betrayal, could ever take away. But there was more at stake than just her personal revenge. The war was still raging, and Ceres knew that her return would stir up conflict. She had no intention of letting her father continue to rule with fear and intimidation. The empire needed change. It needed someone who could lead them into a new era. As she prepared for the journey ahead, Ceres felt a mix of determination and uncertainty. The path she was about to take would be fraught with danger, and she didn't know what awaited her in the capital. But she knew one thing: she would no longer be the helpless princess abandoned in the desert. She had become something more. And when she arrived, the galaxy would never be the same. Ceres had spent weeks preparing herself for the long journey back to the capital. The desert, once a place of death and struggle, now felt like a distant memory. She had changed. The power she had gained from the ancient crystal had transformed her, body and mind. She was no longer the rebellious princess who had been abandoned in the desert. Now she was a force to be reckoned with, stronger, smarter, and more determined than ever before. The capital was far away, and the journey would be difficult. But Ceres felt ready. She was no longer afraid of the unknown. The desert had taught her how to survive. The power she had discovered had given her the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As she traveled across the galaxy, Ceres couldn't help but think of her father, King Varric. He had abandoned her, left her to die in the desert. She had once believed that he was invincible, that his power was unquestionable. But now she saw him differently. The empire he ruled was falling apart, and it was his own doing. His fear and arrogance had driven him to make decisions that had cost him not just his people's trust, but his daughter as well. The closer Ceres got to the capital, the more her resolve strengthened. She would return, not just to reclaim her place as heir to the throne, but to show her people that there was a different way to lead, one built on strength, honor, and unity, not fear and control. The capital loomed in the distance, its towering spires shining in the light of the distant star. It seemed so far away, yet so close. Ceres had dreamed of this moment, but now that it was here, she felt a mix of emotions. She was ready, but the fear of the unknown still lingered in the back of her mind. Her thoughts were interrupted when she felt a disturbance in the air. A group of soldiers appeared on the horizon, moving quickly toward her. Ceres knew they were from her father's army. They had no idea she was coming, and the look of shock on their faces when they saw her would be priceless. She stood tall, ready for whatever came next. She didn't need to hide. She didn't need to run. She was a princess, and she was ready to face the consequences of her actions. The soldiers stopped in their tracks as they saw Ceres standing before them. For a moment, there was silence, and then one of them spoke. You're alive?" he asked, his voice full of disbelief. Ceres nodded, her expression calm but firm. "Yes, and I've come to take my place." The soldiers hesitated, unsure of what to do. They had been loyal to the king, but they knew the rumors about Ceres' survival. Some had even heard of the strange power she now wielded. It was said she had become more than just a princess, that she had become something else, something powerful. Without another word, Ceres raised her hand. The air around her seemed to hum with energy, and the soldiers took a step back. They had seen the power of the crystal, and they knew they were no match for it. Ceres didn't need to fight them. She didn't need to prove herself. Her presence alone was enough. One of the soldiers stepped forward, his voice shaking. We cannot go back. The king has lost control. The people are starting to turn against him. Ceres' heart skipped a beat. The rumors were true. Her father's rule was crumbling. The soldiers were no longer loyal to him. They had seen the writing on the wall, and they knew that the time for change had come. Ceres looked at them, her expression softening. Then come with me. Together, we can bring the empire back to what it was meant to be. The soldiers exchanged uncertain glances, but they had already seen the power Ceres now commanded. They had seen the hope in the eyes of the people. They had no choice but to follow her. And so, they did. The group continued their journey toward the capital, and as they got closer, Ceres could feel the tension in the air. The people were restless. The empire was on the brink of collapse, and they were waiting for someone to lead them. When they finally entered the capital, Ceres was struck by how different it felt. The streets were quieter than she remembered. The people moved with purpose, but their eyes were filled with uncertainty. It was clear that something had changed. Something was broken, and the empire was no longer the great force it once was. The palace loomed before her, its tall spires casting long shadows over the city. It had been her home, the place where she had grown up, but now it felt like a prison that her father had built for himself. Ceres walked up the steps to the grand entrance, the soldiers following behind her. As they reached the doors, they were met by more of the king's men. But this time, Ceres didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her presence undeniable. "The king has failed," she said, her voice strong. "I am the true heir to this throne, and I will lead this empire to a better future." The guards hesitated for a moment, but then they stepped aside. Ceres had returned, and there was no turning back now. The grand hall of the palace was quiet, too quiet for Ceres. The marble floors beneath her feet gleamed, and the high arches above her seemed to stretch into the heavens. But the beauty of the palace did nothing to calm her nerves. This place, once a symbol of power and safety, now felt cold and distant, like a place where only memories lingered. Ceres stood before the massive doors that led into her father's throne room. The soldiers who had followed her into the capital stood behind her, their faces filled with uncertainty. They had followed her because they had seen her power, her strength, and the hope she brought. But they were unsure of what would happen when she stepped inside and faced the king. King Varric, her father, was a powerful ruler. He had been feared and respected across the galaxy. But Ceres now saw him differently. She had learned too much in her time alone. And the truth about him, and the empire he ruled, was clear. He had been selfish, ruling with fear and cruelty, and abandoning his own daughter when she needed him most. The doors creaked open, and Ceres walked inside, her heart pounding in her chest. The throne room was just as she remembered, grand, intimidating, and full of dark, oppressive power. King Varric sat on his throne, his stern face glowing under the light from the high windows. His eyes widened in surprise when he saw Ceres standing there, but he quickly masked his shock with a look of cold authority. "So you've returned," Varric said, his voice deep and strong, though there was a slight tremor beneath his words. "I thought you were dead." Ceres didn't flinch. She stood tall, her gaze unwavering as she looked at the father who had abandoned her. "You left me to die, father," she said, her voice calm but filled with quiet fury. "You believed I was weak, that I couldn't survive. But I did. I've learned the truth of what you've become." Varric's face hardened, and for a moment, Ceres saw the fear flash in his eyes. He was no longer the king who commanded loyalty with every word. Now, he was a man who feared his own daughter. "The war has cost us much," the king said, his voice now softer, tinged with regret. "I did what I thought was best. You were reckless, Ceres. You endangered everything for your own pride." "Pride?" Ceres's voice grew stronger. "You call it pride. I wanted to protect our people, to prove that I could fight. But you didn't care. You left me in the desert, thinking I was nothing." She paused, allowing her words to sink in, and then continued. "But I'm not nothing, Father. I've changed. I found something that you've never understood. True strength." Varric scoffed, his gaze cold. "You think you found strength in your time alone. You're nothing but a child who can't see the bigger picture. I am the king. I have led this empire for years. And you think you can take that from me?" Ceres took a step forward, her eyes locking with his. "The empire is already lost, Father. It's crumbling under your rule. The people no longer follow you because they fear you. They follow me because they see hope in me." Varric stood up suddenly, his fists clenched. "You are wrong. You are just like your mother, weak and foolish." Ceres took another step forward, her voice growing even more forceful. "I am not like her. I am not weak. And I'm certainly not foolish. I've learned what you never taught me. The power of leadership lies not in fear, but in respect. The people need someone who understands them, someone who will unite them." Varric's face twisted with anger. He took a step toward her, his eyes burning with hatred. "You think you can lead. You are nothing. I made you who you are, and I can unmake you just as easily." Ceres stood firm, her eyes not leaving his. "No, Father, you didn't make me. I made myself, and I will lead, whether you like it or not." The room was silent, the tension thick between them. Ceres could feel the weight of her words, and she knew this was the moment of truth. She had come so far, had fought so hard to survive, and now she was finally standing before the man who had once been her everything, ready to take what was rightfully hers. Varric looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of fear, pride, and regret. For the first time, Ceres saw him for what he truly was: weak, afraid of losing control. He had ruled through fear for so long that he had forgotten what it meant to lead with heart. "You have no choice but to step down, Father," Ceres said softly, but her voice was strong. "I will lead this empire, and I will restore what you have broken. You've had your time." Varric stared at her, the realization of his own failure settling in. He had ruled with an iron fist, but he had failed to see what truly mattered: his people, his daughter, and the future of the empire. Finally, with a sigh, he turned away from her, his shoulders slumped. "Then do it. Take the throne. You have beaten me." Ceres watched him for a long moment before she walked to the throne. She wasn't doing this for revenge. She wasn't even doing it for herself. She was doing it for the empire, for the people who had been left in the darkness. And with that, the change had begun. The palace was silent as Ceres sat on her father's throne. The weight of the crown felt heavy, but it was not the weight of power that burdened her. It was the responsibility. She looked around the grand throne room, the same room she had once dreamed of ruling from. The walls, the columns, the cold marble floor, all of it seemed unchanged, but Ceres had changed. She had learned so much in her time alone, in the desert, and from facing her father. She was not the same rebellious princess who had been abandoned by her people. She was a leader now, one who would guide the empire into a new era. Ceres had sent word to the people of the capital, calling them to gather in the city square. She had made her decision. Today, she would show them who she was and what she stood for. The palace may have been her home, but the people outside were her true responsibility. It was for them that she would fight, and for them that she would rule. As the sun began to set, the capital came alive. People from all walks of life gathered in the streets, their faces filled with hope and curiosity. Rumors of Ceres' return had spread like wildfire, and now they would see for themselves what kind of ruler she would be. Would she be like her father, ruling with fear and cruelty? Or would she be something new, something different? Ceres stood on the balcony of the palace, overlooking the crowd below. She felt their eyes on her, their expectations. The weight of it pressed down on her chest. But she stood tall. She had earned this moment. She had fought for it. And now, it was time to show them the truth. The people fell silent as Ceres stepped forward, her presence commanding the room. She could feel the energy in the air, the tension building. For so long, the people had been afraid of change. They had been afraid of the future. But now, Ceres was here to offer them something new, something they hadn't had in a long time. Hope. My people, Ceres began, her voice strong and clear. For too long, you have lived in fear, fear of my father's rule, fear of a war that has taken so much from us. But today, that fear ends. Today, we begin a new chapter. A chapter where we work together to rebuild our empire, stronger and united. The crowd was still, waiting for her next words. Ceres could feel their eyes on her, but she was no longer afraid. She had faced the desert. She had faced her father. And now, she would face her people with honesty. I am not the same princess who was left to die in the desert, she continued. I am not the same person who fought for pride and power. I am someone who has learned the true meaning of strength. True strength does not come from ruling with fear. It comes from listening, understanding, and uniting our people. There was a murmur in the crowd, a shift. The people were listening. They were beginning to believe in her. And for the first time in a long time, Ceres felt a sense of hope inside her. The empire could be saved. It could be rebuilt. But it would take work. It would take trust. And it would take time. I promise you this, Ceres said, her voice growing more confident. I will lead this empire not with cruelty, but with compassion. I will not leave any of you behind. Together, we will rebuild, we will heal, and we will rise stronger than ever before. This is our time, our future, and I will be with you every step of the way. A cheer erupted from the crowd, a sound of pure joy and relief. The people were no longer afraid. They had found hope, and they had found it in Ceres. She had shown them that there was another way. She had shown them that strength could come from kindness, and leadership could come from love for the people. As the cheers filled the air, Ceres looked out over the crowd, her heart swelling with pride. She had done it. She had taken back her empire, not through violence or anger, but through understanding and courage. She had proven that even the darkest of times could lead to the brightest of futures. Her father, King Varric, had ruled with fear, but Ceres would rule with strength, unity, and compassion. She was no longer just the rebellious daughter of a king. She was the leader of an empire, and her journey had only just begun. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Ceres felt ready. She had learned from her past mistakes, and she would never forget the lessons the desert had taught her. The people would follow her because they saw in her the change they needed, and together they would create a new empire, one that was built on hope, not fear. Ceres smiled, her heart full. The desert had once been her greatest enemy, but now it was her greatest teacher. And with that, she stepped forward, ready to lead the galaxy into a new dawn.